Welcome everyone to this second session of the day. I'm Chelsea Moon, Director of Learning and Development at Enerflo. Thank you so much for attending and joining us. Regulations and policies can make or break the solar industry, and today's session is all about understanding the shifting landscape. From net metering changes to tax incentives, we'll explore how to stay ahead in this dynamic environment. So, without further ado, let me quickly introduce our moderator and panelists. Our moderator today is Pat Bennett, Enerflow's co-founder, and our panelists. First off, we have Julia Piper, VP of Public Affairs at GoodLeap, and is an RSA Steering Committee member. And then we have Ben Miller, U.S. Business Development Director at Jinko Solar. And you may also know him from the Florida Solar Industries Association Board. Now, we're going to go ahead and launch a quick poll here. So you should see a poll show up on your screen. Please just take a quick moment, answer those two questions, and then we'll kick this off and get started. All right, let's take a look at our results. So for the first one, which policy area will have the biggest impact on the solar industry in the next year? Most of you said federal tax incentives. And for our second question, what is the most effective way for solar companies to influence policy changes? And the majority of you said direct engagement with legislatures. So with that, I'm going to hand the reins on over to Pat and let you all get started here.
Awesome. Thanks, Chelsea. Thanks, Julia and Ben, for being on today. As early as today, there's Utah legislation being passed around some things we'll talk about today. And so this stuff moves quickly, and I know you guys have a good ear to the ground. And so excited to jump in today. Julia, I think you prepared some stuff that maybe we could start with that we can go through of kind of the latest things that people might be want to be aware of. But I think today we really want to focus on what are the key things happening in this legislative session, because the new one is starting, and what are the kind of top things we might see and how those might carry into other states, and obviously a focus on consumer protection and what we can do as an industry to ensure consumers are being taken care of so that lawmakers don't create policies and laws that could really hurt the industry because of lack of information or because of consumers being ticked off. So I'll hand it to you, and then Ben, feel free to chime in or add comments to things Julia says, and I'll provide some questions throughout as we go.
Awesome. Great to join you guys. And Ben is a true pro on so much of this stuff. And Pat, thanks for creating this forum, because I think the challenging thing about policy is it's wonky, right? It happens in these, it's both slow and fast moving. Things can take years to come to fruition. And then all of a sudden, like you said, in a day, you've got a bill advancing really quickly. And we are texting friends in the industry saying, what can you live with? What can't you live with? And so it's both fast and slow. And I know it is a resource suck in the sense that it requires time and effort, but I think the stakes are so high and it really can affect everyone's business and the future trajectory of the industry overall. We do live in this world where we're regulated as businesses that operate in states and have business licenses, but also the energy industry itself is highly regulated, right? So the way that utility rates change affects the product that we offer. So I appreciate you creating this forum, because this is the only way we can all get on the same page and want GoodLeap and myself to always be a resource. And the state trade groups and federal trade groups are resources too. So just I'll quickly add that in addition to being a member of the Residential Solar Association, I also sit on the board of SEIA, the Solar Energy Industries Association. We're members of many state trades, and those really are your resources. The staff there do an excellent job. So with that wind up, I really was hoping to prepare some slides. I've been back and forth to DC, Tallahassee, and Sacramento in the past 10 days. And so my slide making skills didn't quite come together, but I will certainly walk you through some key talking points. First is, I agree with the survey that was just conducted. There's a major focus on federal policy right now. As folks may know, obviously change in government took place. Republicans hold the White House, the Senate, and the House in Washington, D.C. That gives them the ability to pass what's called a reconciliation bill. It means you don't need 60 votes in the Senate. You don't need to pass it on a bipartisan basis. Republicans have the power to pass certain types of legislation just with their simple majorities, 50+%, right? So why does that matter? It means they can specifically work on a tax bill they've really been wanting to work on. This would be an extension of tax cuts, a longstanding Republican priority. But tax cuts cost money. So they're looking really closely at how do we pay for that, right? And so tax credits are a way to, as someone would frame it, be a pay for. You reduce the tax credit there, you can increase the tax cuts for everyone if you reduce the tax credit for clean energy and other energy sources. What we are trying to say, and I think is a main takeaway for this group, is we don't view tax credits as a cost. They are economic development policy. They are investments back into the US economy. They're investments in jobs, in other tax revenue that businesses provide to local economies, overall benefits to consumers, things that we work on in this industry in solar. It's often direct savings on people's bills, resilience to their homes with storage. So that message is super important to get across because lawmakers are looking at ways to cut government spending. They need to hear directly on why something that looks like a pure cost is actually, again, an investment in the economy. Something like for every public dollar invested through a clean energy tax credit, there's 4x private dollars that follow it. We are actually, growing the US economy based on this, and the jobs numbers bear that out. The onshoring of manufacturing bears that out. The deployment figures for solar projects prove that's true. We have other policy speed bumps along the way that cause volume to grow or decline. But overall, it's been a really successful industry. And frankly, lawmakers need to hear it. So anyone on this call, my call to action to you, and we can talk more about the how, is to know that the tax credit discussion, if that affects your business, you need to be involved. It's something like taking a day and putting folks in a truck and driving to see your local representative in Reno, in Orange County, in New York, Long Island. Some of those Republicans are actually pro clean energy, but they need to hear from the local folks who work in their district just what's at stake. How many families rely on your company? How many jobs are at stake? I know this sounds really retail politics oriented, but that's how they know what matters. They're making big decisions. And I can talk more and I will put some links in the chat here as we move along on how you can get more engaged. How is it you request a meeting with your local lawmaker? But I just want to impress that we're at a pretty significant crossroads here on federal tax policy. The Inflation Reduction Act locked in that 30% tax credit plus some adders for TPO products for roughly a decade. We're talking now about having that timeline cut short. We're talking now about maybe the adders for domestic content and energy communities and low-income communities maybe going away. I even just heard on a call right before I joined today that there's discussions of making it so that only baseload power qualifies for the tax credits, meaning not solar. Only nuclear or fossil fuel plants could qualify for the core 30% tax credit. That concept's being floated. Or the idea of so many restrictions on any foreign entities and foreign products that the tax credit again becomes impossible to use. And so we need to go educate lawmakers who have reasonable questions on what's at stake when they weigh those decisions. Happy to talk more about the different buckets of tax credits on federal policy. The other bucket we'll dig into more is consumer protection. That's really front of mind for us here at Good Leap. There are 14 states plus California, 15 if you count this disclosure form they're about to update, that are working on some kind of consumer protection regulation or legislation. So changing the law to enhance consumer protections, some other rulemaking. The concepts float around from increased bond requirements for installers. Nevada had proposed a per project bond equal to the amount of the project. So if you have a $50,000 solar plus storage system going in Nevada, the installer would have to obtain a $50,000 bond for that project and every other project they do. We talked to the bonding community. That's not something a solar installer can reasonably attain. So this is where the devil's in the details of what are the consumer protection proposals being put forward. The goal there is to have customers made whole if their project doesn't work or something happens and they don't get to PTO. But we need to educate on what kind of tools are in the toolkit, what will actually work for industry while also enhancing consumer protection. So I can dig into some of those 14 states, but I do want to give Ben a chance here to set the scene from his vantage point.
No, I think that's a great overview and talking about getting these things on the national level, obviously come down and affect the state level. But Ben, I know with your participation in SEA, especially in Florida, how does it vary at the local level or state level? And how do you think the national policies or things could eventually trickle down?
All the federal laws essentially trickle down in some way or another, right? And so if there are rules that affect federal rules that affect tax incentives, that's an immediate trickle down, if you will. It's a direct impact. So that becomes very important. When I look at state work, because I think it said I was board president, but I'm actually past president of FLACIA here in Florida, we have the same type of activities just for different parts, right? So in state rules, we may have the consumer protection portion. We're also looking at contracting law, net metering, those things that also can affect. And when I think about those, I really think about not whether there is a consumer protection law in place, it's whether there's a bad or a good protection law in place. And so a good law may be just a good disclosure law that is common sense and easy to pull off, and everybody should be okay with it. A bad law may require something onerous like a bond on every single project that you can't actually even pull off and only adds cost to a project. Really what we're looking at, good law and keeping things good there. But in terms of engagement, Julia's 100% right. We, as an industry, yes, we are trade in a way, right? We're electricians, we're solar contractors, we're engineers. Those things are all important from a trade level, but we're also in the energy community, right? And so energy policy is heavily regulated and it's heavily lobbied. And we can't actually treat our work as just a kind of a trade work. Carpenters do not have to do the level of policy work that solar contractors have to. And the reason why is because we're in the energy industry in some way or another. And so being able to get involved as a contractor, as a salesperson, as a solar professional is super important. Now, you may not be big enough to have your own Julia Piper, right? You may not be that blessed, right? But what you can do is a few things. You can get involved, one with your state association, at least again, a state association. You can also be involved with SIA at the national level. But you can, through that involvement, just being a member, that's helpful because that helps pay for staff. But two, you can then also get involved on committees. You can take up action by meeting with your local representative, which again, your state association can help you do. You can figure out what type of messaging is important today to take to those. And you can actually not just meet with your representative, if you can, become friendly with them, right? I think it's really important that people understand that, yes, there may be some bad actors in the legislature, just like there's bad actors in solar and lawyers and air conditioning contractors, and every industry's got their bad actors. But there is also a lot of people that sign up to become a legislator because they want to do some good. And so they go to whatever capital they have with some level of good intentions, and they get presented with bills, 600 at a time, that they've got to read in 2 weeks and then decide to vote on. There's no possible way that they could do that properly. And so they either vote with a friend, they vote with somebody that's been talking to them, or they get a bill, let's say it's a solar bill, they don't know much about it, but they've met you. They may give you a call. They've met the association members. They may give us a call. And so that kind of grassroots slash real touch is actually really important. And people think about, hey, there's got to be a lot of money involved. Money is always helpful, but personal relationships are important as well.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, that's great insight and kind of that on the ground stuff we want to get into. So Julia, you were mentioning these 14 items, and I think there's probably some people still listening. Oh, we still have time. But I think you would probably argue that it's happening. Things are happening every day that we may not even know about, and we really need to act now. So if you want to start getting into some of those key issues, and then again, just from an urgency standpoint, how we need to start thinking about this as an industry, we can go there.
Yeah, I know empathy for people who run businesses and are out in the field every day and managing teams. I know it's hard. And so please reach out to me or your trade group again for help. I view policy as kind of Switzerland, where if we don't all succeed as an industry, no one succeeds. So it's the only thing that I think is a problem is if you're on the fence. If you are not sending emails to your employees to get them to send a letter to their congressman to protect the tax credits, it's only your business on the line, not just your neighbors and your competitors. I think the actions should be commensurate with what you have at stake. If the 30% tax credit plus all the bonuses went away in 2026, how much of your business would you lose? 80%? 20%? You might justify then taking people off the job site for a day or two to go actually meet with your local lawmaker or lawmakers. So I think the actions need to be commensurate to what you have at stake and think through truly what those impacts are. And again, I can give you all the tools and others can too, the trade groups, on how to do that. So consumer protection is a little more block and tackle. It's like every state has, again, as I mentioned, these different proposals. We're seeing some trends though. We know Nevada passed that AB or SB 293 a year or two ago that blocked the sales, the ability for 1099 sales individuals to sell solar in that state. We are seeing some additional bills that will likely come back this year to try and close some loopholes. The lawmakers are aware that some people are still putting folks on a W-2 salary, but at a minimal amount, and then still paying largely through commission through 1099. We know that they're aware of that and they want to close that loophole and add additional fines. So that'll be something. They have not passed that bill yet. We're in the early stages of that legislative session in Nevada, but that's on their radar. I mentioned the bonds that we've actually been working through SIA and with other, companies. And it looks like the per project bond in Nevada is going to be off the table, but there's discussion of a blanket bond. So something like $100,000, $200,000 that a company has to retain on an ongoing basis to cover issues with projects as they crop up. This is actually stemming from the fact that the state had a recovery fund where it was like a public fund where customers who are really in a pickle, the contractor wasn't around to help them, their project was not producing, savings are actually broken, they could draw on this public fund. But the public's dollars are limited and the states are starting to say, wait a minute, why is everyone paying for the ills of some? And so this is where we come back to what can the industry do as a collective? So bonds are a new concept, but I've been having honestly struggles of figuring out what's the right bond amount. Everyone on this call would know better than I, like how much can your company get a bond for? Is 100,000 a reasonable amount? And this is where we get into the details and why it's so important to have business leaders on these calls to actually say, wait a minute, here's what I think we could actually do. Because I will take that and others too, and we'll hand that to the lawmaker with reasonable justification of here's what would actually work and why we think it would solve a problem. So that's like an active discussion there. Similarly, in Utah, there's a bonding requirement that would be included in the bill that just had a hearing today that the RSA, and I see Chris is their executive director, is on the webinar today. He does a fantastic job of organizing those members. And Pat, I know you've been involved. People showed up today for this hearing. That's huge. People got out of their offices and actually drove to the hearing. So super big thank you to everyone who did that in Utah today. That's how the lawmakers hear that this has local impact, because there's a bond requirement in Utah, but also they propose the 1099 solar salesperson ban there as well. So if that affects your business, you might want to raise your hand. What they're really getting after, and I want Ben's thoughts on this, is responsibility in the sales, connected through the customer's ultimate experience, not just through install even, but ongoing. And are the savings materializing? Because we all know there are challenges around predicting savings. And Pat, you guys are the pros at this. How do you know the energy someone's going to use in the future? We need a balanced discussion here, but there's definitely more focus on making sure that the right reasonable assumptions are being used at that point of sale, so the customer has a good, valuable product, and we can ensure, and at least ensure that within a reasonable band. So Utah also proposed no customer payments on a loan product until PTO, until interconnection. As a lender, that can be really challenging because the interconnection timeline date moves a lot. So it's hard for us to keep costs low when that's a moving target. We would at least maybe want a longer timeline, but the ability to say collect payment after 90 days, something like that, where in theory the customers got to PTO in that timeline, we can model financially around that. I've only spouted off 2 states there of the 14, but you can see the types of proposals that are coming up. Sales commission, savings, again, bonding, quality of work being another bucket. And then disclosures, we're always seeing new disclosure forms pop up and making sure that customers understand what they're getting on the front end. And so the one other I'll point you to now is a little more in the weeds, but you can give me content and feedback this week and I'll incorporate it, is California's proposed a new disclosure form on top of the other existing ones. So if you work in that market, they want to make this effective July 1. We're pushing back on that date because that's coming up pretty soon. What this new form would do is require everyone to have a mandatory first year savings calculation. for not only solar, but solar and storage. And in the solar and storage scenario, you have to model out 3 different types of battery savings in the first year. One optimized for savings, one optimized for self-consumption, and one optimized for backup. A lot of scenarios everyone would be running just to provide on a disclosure form, but it would be a standard across the industry. So they're accepting the last round of comments this week. CALSA, the California trade groups, really taking the pen on that. So this is where it comes back to those trade groups. If you care about what that mandatory first year savings calculation you're going to have to do looks like, now's the time to get involved. So that speaks to the urgency. So
Yeah,
I can
so
go
that
into any number of those 14 states, but hopefully that
yeah,
gives
no, those are great. I did want to maybe double click on the 1099 requirement.
Yeah.
This was thought of as a consumer protection measure. Nevada's been doing it for a little while. Is there even any proof that requiring salespeople to be W-2 actually leads to consumer protection? Because like, where does the feedback loop come of, okay, they've done it, it's been over a year. It sounds like they're trying to close loopholes more from like regulating that policy, but what do we know as far as is it actually improving the sales process just because someone is W-2 compared to 1099?
Look, there are historic examples of companies that had W-2 workers who also had a lot of consumer protection issues. I'm not going to name any names, but how someone gets paid, I'm not sure makes the difference. However, Nevada did notice, and their consumer protection divisions said there was a decline in complaints. This is all stemming, by the way, from an exponential increase in customer complaints. So it's not like we're suddenly like the boogeyman of the day. Complaints are up, and we have to figure out how to solve that. Now, volume is also up. So we often point to that of like, actually, in many cases, the
Yeah,
number of complaints is higher, but as a proportion of volume, overall complaints is lower. But public policy folks who work in that industry don't necessarily see it that way. They still have to field every one of those calls. And as an industry, we want to strive for zero, right? So we're in the zone of where this is why we have to work on it. But I think to answer your question, Nevada, they did find a reduction in complaints, but they haven't shared the proportion of them. I think overall, when we look at Nevada, it is that scenario where volume is so much higher that the actual number of complaints is relatively low. But I think the problem is when the complaints are really bad, and say it's a person who's older or didn't speak English as a first language, who really seems like they got taken advantage of. And that's where there's, I think, zero tolerance, and that the public policymakers want to get to zero.
So Ben, as we're thinking about consumer protection and so much of the stems on what was actually told to the customer from the sales rep. Sometimes sales rep is or is not part of the install group. They might even be their own entity. But as you think about, okay, let's wake up as an industry and let's actually do some things that would be good for everybody. Not look at this as a negative, but how do we actually embrace some of these things and make it better? What are some things that could be done on the sales side to actually improve consumer protection, but also maybe just improve pull-through rates and other things? And like, how do we combine it all to make it look like a good thing for everybody?
Yeah, I think I've been able to work at a few different companies and evaluate a lot of different contracting businesses and take a look. And now through Flacia, I've got to do a lot of work there. And so what I see from policymakers when they're thinking about, hey, do we license a salesperson? Do we make them a W-2? What I'm really looking at is what they're looking for is somebody to be responsible, right? In the state of Florida, that responsible party by law is the contractor. I know it's not there everywhere in the country, but what they're looking for is, hey, whoever is actually licensed to be doing this work, you need to have command and control over your sales process. We sometimes we're very quick to blame a salesperson, and there's probably some validity to some of those things. But also there's an issue where if the contractor or EPC and the sales group are not aligned in who's communicating what at what time, that can also lead to an issue, right? We know that when you're doing a sale, if the homeowner says, no, let's just get the paperwork done and sign, right? You got to get things signed, right? And so when that happens, who tells the rest of the disclosures? How do things get reinforced? How do you make sure you're doing due care? And again, what I think what the state is looking for, and I think what we should also look for just as an industry is, hey, that licensed individual in your state, however that works, needs to be responsible. We need sales groups to work very closely with their EPCs on making sure they have a very clear and defined process. And again, for Florida, the EPC/contractor is actually prime. meaning that any sales group in Florida must actually be working for and under and be representing that contractor. That needs to be communicated properly. People really need to get a hold and have some command and control of all those things. And that's what policymakers are looking for. I think that's what we should look for. Flacia will have, when we have our summit, we'll actually have a whole session on command and control. But I think that's, if we can get there, we can show, hey, here's good behavior, and then it makes it our word even more meaningful when we go and talk to actually policymakers that are concerned about it as well.
If I can actually jump in, I think another tool in our toolkit here, you're talking about ways someone gets paid. And I think the core reason folks are presenting this W-2 channel is to make that tighter link, as I think Ben was talking about, between the installer and the salesperson. The idea that you probably train that person directly if they are your direct employee versus a little bit of arm's length. Because I've talked to policymakers who say we just can't track down the responsible party. The salesperson will say it was the installer. The installer's like, oh, well, it wasn't us. And then the financiers, we weren't at the kitchen table, but we do accept the payment on the project. And around we go, who is really, to be held responsible in this? And I think we all have a role to play. One of the solutions put forward is recheck. And I think I saw Ohm Analytics on the opening session. They have this recheck initiative, which companies like GoodLeap and several others have signed on to, where you create a sort of registry, learning a little bit from the mortgage industry, where there's a central repository, a sort of profile, if you will, of the state licenses that you have, of any ongoing trainings and certifications that you have as an individual salesperson in the industry, which installers you work with. We're starting to see states mandate that the salesperson is affiliated and transparent about exactly which installer they are working for. So this could become a place, and Recheck is evolving their product. I don't want to speak for them, but it's a kind of place we view to gather information in one place. And hopefully, as states pass laws, it will sync up with Recheck is my goal. And that, for instance, Texas has a consumer protection bill advancing right now that would create a new salesperson registry in that state for solar. There are also personal fines as well as company fines. So their thought is to also connect individual actions to potential ramifications. If the state of Texas creates its own registry, what does that look like? Are we all, as players in the market who want that information or have to report that information, syncing up with some new portal? Is it an Excel spreadsheet? Could it be Recheck? Could the state of Texas adopt Recheck and that becomes their actual tool? Because we start to get into the functionality discussions of, okay, great, we're going to track individuals in an industry. How does that work? That could create a lot of red tape and friction for a lot of different companies. And I know we're all trying to work faster and leverage technology to be an avant-garde industry. And if something like this could really slow things down. So my hope is that as states like Texas consider, and they're still, again, working this bill through the process. My colleague Courtney's in Austin today meeting with the bill sponsors. I hope we can create some synergy, because my fear is state by state, we have these different registries, or they just outlaw and go to W-2, and that's almost an alternative to a registry, as you say W-2, or we say it doesn't really matter how you get paid, or even if you are W-2, we still want to know who sold a project at a given point in time and have a record of that person's licenses and trainings. And I also mentioned trainings, and I think we talked about this previously. SEIA has a new set of standards coming out. The American National Standards Institute designated SEIA to create new solar sales training standards. Anticipate those will be finalized over the summer. Then they'll start to roll out, and that'll be a set of standardized training across the industry. And then you'll have to actually go through a course and get your certification. I said the word have to. I anticipate it'll be voluntary initially, but states will probably also start to layer on training. So I see a world where you have to both register with the state, your name, who you work for, and any licenses you have, and then also whether or not you have the appropriate trainings and you've actually gone through that process. And maybe something like a recheck can be the repository, the profile, if you will. So I put that out there. These are a lot of pieces that are moving. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but the laws creating the registries are very much in motion in several states.
Julie, I'll add to that. So the state of Florida, for Flacia anyway, we've actually created an actual course already. And the course was done with some lawyers. And the course it's really for everybody, but the biggest target is for salespeople. And it is about Florida law as it pertains to solar sales. And what we find is a lot of people that are in the industry, many get trained for 2 weeks and then they're out knocking doors and then they learn how to close and then they're closing. We're trying to make sure that our members take this, and then any contractors have their salespeople absolutely take the course, where we give them a kind of a badge number / registration number. But you should know the laws of the state that you're working in and selling in. And so that is the goal there, is to make sure that the person there is, one, working for a licensed contractor, and two, understands the laws that are, important to both solar and to the state of Florida. And so you should definitely, though, there's some laws that are specific to Florida that are not in Maryland. So we're going to make sure that we're focused on, hey, here's what you should know if you're operating here, and here's how contractor law works here.
Yeah, Ben, that's awesome. I'd love for you to maybe dig in a little more into the process you guys came up with to generate that training in, because I think there's two ways this can go, right? We work with trade groups and we do more of a bottoms up and say, hey, we're ready to do this and adopt it. And we did all the research and here's the great things. And then policymakers can adopt that. Or some of these things are created in a vacuum and then put on the industry. So how did you guys maybe approach it, and how could that be a model for other states or organizations to do it that way?
So we have an ethics committee, and so that ethics committee often hears of some of the worst situations that happens for homeowners. And when we start thinking about these things, we thought of them through the lens of what would have helped here. And these things are like, hey, what would have helped in a disclosure? Or, hey, what would have helped? Or, hey, would it have helped that the salesperson knew about the law? Would it have helped that the salesperson knew that they had to state that they were working with X contractor and that they cannot actually work as an independent group and just have an installer install for them, right? So all these types of things we figured out. We figured out that people were looking up permits and then going after people's contracted work, which could be, in state of Florida, I believe it could be tortious interference, right? And so making sure people know these laws were really important. And we saw the actual things going on. And we didn't just assume that, oh, this is all somebody committing complete fraud. We actually looked at it as, if they would have known this, could they have prevented this, right? Because the more people know the rules, believe it or not, there's a good chunk of us in the industry that really want to do the right things. That information gets passed along, and you can probably see it in Facebook groups of all the bad information that gets passed along, and all the rushes to judgment that get thrown about. And so having more of us actually really know what the laws are really important if you're going to be in this business.
Yeah, that's a great point. Julia, he mentioned a point that you told me one time, and maybe it'd be helpful, just one or two more topics here before we jump to Q&A. How are the kind of lawmakers and policymakers gathering their information, right? Because I think you told me one time they're actually hanging out in these Reddit groups now and Facebook groups. And we may not know that as we're posting things, they're actually seeing everything. So what do you hear, and where should we maybe, be a little more cognizant of how they're gathering their info?
I always assume anything public is public, right? So if you're commenting on a social media platform, even if it is a moderated group, it's still public information. And there's I know for a fact in Nevada, the lawmakers were seeing exactly how people were adapting to that law they passed. And to be fair, the law wasn't super clear. They didn't specify exactly to the level of detail exactly how you had to pay every individual. So this is where, again, there's shortcomings in how you're supposed to read that law. So, but that's where they get information. They see Instagram, and certainly Instagram videos. They'll see people's posts about great successes. And some of that's really positive and the best of American entrepreneurialism. And some of that I think they view as potentially predatory, frankly. And the solar industry has long talked about how we're this benefit to society. And I think people give us a lot of credit for that. And so if it's viewed as evolving away from that, of providing a core service in terms of energy and providing savings and resilience, people start to question if something's amiss here. And so I would just be conscious of all the content you and your teams put out there. And is it really doing the core thing solar is meant to do? Provide a benefit to like any customer in any industry, provide a benefit to them. So yeah, I would assume someone can find all that material. They do also learn a lot from the meetings, right? If you have a one-on-one, and folks know that there's a lot of great actors in the industry, especially in our industry where we've had a lot of success. And so it's understood that there's bad apples, but I guess I said earlier, I hear more of a no tolerance at all kind of mentality. And so I think there are things we can do. There's tools we're adopting here at Good Leap, ways to validate customers understood what they heard at the point of sale and eliminate some of those miscommunications, frankly. I think there's a lot that proposal tools can play this really key role. We need other financiers like ourselves to step up and play a role universally, because as long as there is one bad actor, everyone bears the brunt. And I go into meetings and say, look at all these great things we've done in this state, or with these actors, look at how all the new tools we've adopted to validate customer ID or do a call confirmation or the concept of recheck. And great, but as long as not everyone's doing that, my number of complaints is still ticking up. And so we all bear the brunt of that. That's why I come back to, we have to move as an industry, because the bad acts of one kind of hurt everyone. And I do want to mention one specific example. There is tax advice obviously going around in response to the tax credits. And I want to just remind folks that if you're an installer or a salesperson or even a proposal tool or a financier, unless you are that individual's registered licensed accountant, you really should not be providing tax advice. I know attorneys general in Florida and California have been notified of tax advice that they see going around that they think is really troubling. Things around someone who owns a solar system, maybe claiming business related tax credits. So I just raised that to raise caution for folks, because it's one thing for a customer to go seek tax advice and file their tax claim. And if that doesn't work out when they get audited, they'll deal with the ramifications. It's another thing for a business to make a sale or to profit off of tax advice at a point of sale. So I just raise that as a concern. It's one thing when you know a tax credits existed for decades, like the 30%, there's a lot of law around that, a lot of very clear tax guidance from the IRS. Guidance that's not proven and more complex, I would just suggest people be really careful with, because I know it's on lawmakers' radars, including the IRS.
Yeah, I would
Great reminder. Yeah, Ben.
second that. We've seen that from Lucia. And again, I'm not going to give you tax advice. I would just tell you that we've heard from tax professionals that the information given out to homeowners regarding extra depreciation, taking extra domestic content credits. Hey, net metering is a commercial agreement. That's not true. I can just tell you that definitively in the state of Florida, it's not. But those types of things, if it seems too good to be true, if you feel like you found a secret tax sauce, or you feel like, hey, I'm actually just going to refer them to this person that I know will give them this secret tax sauce, I would be very wary of that. In fact, I probably wouldn't do it.
It's a great reminder. All right, I want to hit on one more thing and then we'll jump into Q&A. So anybody who has questions, you can start putting them in. We've talked, honestly, as we've been talking, some of this seems very like burdensome and like sad, right? Holy crap.
Need a little more stoke here, Pat, right? You're telling me?
Yeah,
Okay.
did we all pick like a really hard industry? Like, is solar just going to be too hard to sell soon? And so we all should just pack up and move to roofing or some other thing. But I guess I'd like to end on that of what is some of the silver lining that you guys see? And should we look at all of these things coming down as bad things? And again, just, yeah, more an optimistic view of, hey, not all this is bad, but it is good to be maybe informed and maybe remember the mission, what we're all part of. But just any kind of last thoughts on the industry as a whole and how we should be maybe looking at this stuff with some silver lining.
You go first, Ben.
Yeah, so I think first of all, solar is still amazing, right? We get this free input from the sun. We're able to share that input with homeowners, businesses, cut open the pie, and we can all benefit from this kind of free and abundant power from the sun. So that is still good. That the basis is still good. We can still help people. And hey, you'd still earn a really good living doing so. The next part is like, hey, look, we went from a cottage industry to an emerging industry, to a booming industry. And now we're going into the next phase where we're looking at new regulations where we're starting to mature, right? And so What we're really just saying is, hey, the mature parties that are in the industry, we have the chance to take part in the process of making sure that there's smart regulation in place. It's not no regulation, it's not all doom and gloom, but it's really, this is a call to say, hey, we should be involved because we need to just make sure things are smartly done in a way that we can all still prosper from and helps homeowners still. And so we have that opportunity. And so that is an opportunity for everybody to be at the table. And what we're just saying is if you're not at the table, bad stuff can happen. So just come sit at the table, eat with us, and let's make sure we all get a slice of the pie.
It's a hard one to beat, Ben. That's good. I think, look, why does everyone get up and go to work every day, including myself, when we're getting into the weeds? There's nothing better than feeling like you're contributing, for me, like to job creation, to a very essential resource, which is energy. We know we don't have the electrons we need for America to win on AI development, on domestic manufacturing. I honestly get motivated by the 50,000-foot level of how does America win more broadly. And I honestly view solar and energy as such a key piece of that. And I think homeowners need help at times of high inflation, and solar, when priced appropriately and communicated transparently, can provide an essential service to people who need a break on their energy bills. Like our boss Hayes talks about growing up using the laundromat to get his football stuff clean, growing up in a poor area of Missouri. And he learned the value of saving 20 bucks a month. And for folks who can save more, even better, the value now of hurricanes hitting large areas of the country, or even wildfires where we have these proactive power shutoffs. With storage sized appropriately, you can literally save someone's life. We have examples of customers who've shared their solar and storage with a neighbor who had a CPAP machine or some kind of medical device, who saved their home, their biggest asset, by having the water, being able to run a pump to just get the water out of their basement in Florida, which would have otherwise flooded their whole home, caused tens of thousands of dollars of damage. The solar and storage system allowed them to just use a pump, protect their largest and biggest asset, their home. There are countless stories like this, and we have to talk about them more, frankly. We're in a place of reconciling with getting to scale and what that takes to be, as Ben said, a more mature industry. And I think both can be true, that there's endless opportunity ahead of us. But you are going to have to be a pro. I think you are going to have to dig into the details, and that's how you will win. Or I do see us being at a little bit of a crossroads where, not that there won't be potential for many people, but that if you don't level up, I do see the laws making your life a lot more difficult and making it a lot harder to operate, because they want to weed out certain practices. So I think the resources are there. Again, always make myself available and want to share resources through Enerflo and others to get everyone on the same page. This is against Switzerland. Let's just rally as a team and get it done.
I agree. That's awesome.
One last shameless plug, which is, if you're super, super busy, you're super constrained already, you're like, this is already hard, join your association, join an association. They have staff to actually do a lot of the hard work. And then just put in your input where you can and do what you can. That's an easy first step. Join your association, let your association carry the water for you. That's first easy step.
That's great advice. All right, real quick, I want to do a quick rapid fire. I'm going to ask a question. Give me the top 3 things that hit your mind. Ben, I'm a sales org. Top 3 things I do tomorrow to help with consumer protection.
Ooh, that's tomorrow. So 1, get with your EPC. Make sure 100% that your quality assurance and sales quality assurance process is in line with that EPC, and make sure there's a full syncing of that information, how it goes out, when it goes out, what's said when, what happens when something goes wrong, what's the script, what's being communicated, who does what to whom, and all of those things for all sorts of contingencies. Make sure that's fully aligned with your processes, not just the standard, but hey, what if we sold, the person just wanted to sign right away? What do we do then?
Right.
That's number 1. Number 2, make sure your salespeople know that as well, right? Make sure that they understand the process, understand the disclosures, and know the state law that they're operating in. They should know those things. And then the third is make sure they understand solar, right? Make sure they understand solar. So those are the things, and then they understand solar and they understand what not to say, right? So those are, there's no misrepresentations.
That's good. Yeah. So you're digging into just training, making sure that everyone's aware. I know a lot of these sales orgs, they'll work with multiple EPCs. So understanding the ins and out of each EPC, because it could vary and definitely vary by state as well. So yeah, I think those are great. Julia, flip it to you on the installer side. What are like top 3 things that the installer should think about or do from a protection standpoint?
Yeah, we said it before, but it bears saying again, join your local state trade group and honestly the federal one too. Join SIA, and actually invitation. The part B of this is there's a call at 11:30 a.m. Eastern time on Mondays that's open to non-SIA members as well, where they're rallying people on tax credit advocacy. It's open to anyone. First of all, SIA membership starts at $900, so most, if not every company can join and get this information directly. But if there is a chat, you'll have to let me know the best place to drop it, or maybe I put it in the lobby room chat, is that call. I would also specifically on tax credits, because I think people identified at the top of this meeting that was the number one policy risk they saw, and I agree. Ask your lawmakers for a meeting. Who's your lawmaker? I'm happy to direct you to them. You can find out where your offices are, and we'll find the congressperson who represents that district. Then, of course, there's 2 state senators in every state, so you'll want to reach out to both of them. There's a playbook I can share of just like how you request the meeting, what you should put in that email, when to go visit, how many people should go. I'm happy to work with anyone on the script. So I'd say join your trade groups, join these calls, and activate on the tax credit issues specifically. And you guys let me know the best place to put some of this stuff. I think everyone thinks it's going to be someone else who does it. Like, oh, even the trade groups got it. The trade groups come to me saying, how can you get someone in the room? Because unless we make this personal, the impact doesn't fully land as much as even me going into a room. Like, I'm just one person who does this for a living. They got to hear from the business owners. They got to hear from the employees. So just those would be some of my top recommendations there.
Yeah, so if you can just send that to me or Jenny or anybody when we send out our recording links and everything else, like resources, we can share all that with us. That'd be awesome. Chelsea, any questions that we may want to ask before we wrap it up?
I think you may have answered many of these along the way, but let me just shoot out a few and maybe you can just reiterate a few things. So, what upcoming policy changes could most impact solar installers and how can they prepare for them?
Yeah, I think we hit on a lot of the main ones.
Yeah. I guess I would just add one thing. We didn't really touch on net metering or fixed charges. Let me just put that on your radar too. I know we're going to have to adapt to these changing utility rates. There's this report that comes out of something like 240 different individual policy actions were taken in residential solar last year. One of the main themes is moving away from retail rate net metering, so one-to-one net metering. We move into these slightly more complicated rate programs and also fixed charges. Starting at the end of this year and early next year, there will be a $26 fixed fee that all customers in California have to pay, whether or not they have solar. So that will change the calculus of their savings. And so I just want to put some of those rate design issues on the radar. Again, your trades are a great place to get those updates, but it's another bucket of not necessarily a bad thing. Some of this makes battery storage look more compelling, and we can sell additional products or virtual power plants, a whole other revenue stream that's potentially out there if we get programs in place. But we do have to adapt our business models to those changing rate programs. So I just flag that bucket as another area to watch for. A lot of activity.
Yeah, I see a lot of like misinformation or misunderstanding around like net billing compared to one-on-one net metering and the differences. And when you really play out the math, it's a massive change in what it can do to someone's savings. So if you're not incorporating those into your calculations, you could be totally misrepresenting someone's savings. And again, without really even realizing it, because you just maybe don't understand how net billing works, or especially tiered rate structures during the day, time of use. So it's really important. I'm glad you brought that one up.
Yeah, and in some states it's going to be more important than others. Like California was a really big, really important change. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you guys probably know more, but it took the ROI down to, or made it go up to maybe 9 years return on investment.
Payback period, yeah.
Years.
At least.
That's what Florida is with one-on-one net metering. If you lose net metering, all of a sudden you end up with this kind of 17 to 20 year timeline. And obviously that just doesn't work, right? You end up with negative cash flow on loans or leases, and it's essentially unsellable except for if you have backup power and that's all they're interested in, right? And some things are not an adjustment and some things have to be really fought for.
Also, Florida has a lot less solar penetration, residential solar penetration than California does, right? You got over 2 million California solar customers, We're nowhere near that in Florida. We're still at 1 or 2% of customers there having solar. It was over 10, I think almost approaching 20, maybe even in California. I'll have to fact check myself on that. So orders of magnitude different. And that's when you see policies change. They're going to evolve. But to Ben's point, it depends on which market you're talking about. But it's still true that it's a trend now to see net metering evolve. And that's where you need to engage in places where lawmakers just need to learn more about why it's a totally fair and reasonable policy to have in place and really helps consumers.
Yeah, and you better believe if utility companies get laws passed like in California or other places, that other states with their utility companies will be pushing for the same things and hiring a lot of lobbyists and trying to get the same trend for them. So, okay, awesome. I think we're good to wrap. Great discussion today. Thank you so much for your time. You guys are rock stars and appreciate all the content you brought. And we will be sending out recording links and some of the content and things Julia mentioned. Some of these playbooks I think are awesome, and we've used some of them in Enerflo, and hope you guys all get more engaged and keep the industry burning bright. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.